money has gone to the schools to build schools. The fundamental issue that the leaders of our school district should be asking, are they better off? Have they brought in more money than they would have if they hadn't participated in the TIF?
Well, you can argue that they could have just floated a separate bond issue for school construction, which they've done many times over the years anyway.
Yes.
Another yes-no question, which is a good one. I think I know this answer too because I read Ben's columns. Are TIFs actually 1/6 of the city budget? I think you've written that since the city budget's $6 billion and there's $1 billion roughly in the TIF fund, even an idiot like me thinks that that would be 1/6. Is that fair math?
I don't know if I've ever. It sounds good. I don't know if I ever wrote that.
That was probably Donkey.
Good, yeah.
That's probably your partner.
Donkey, yeah.
Partner in crime. Okay. But that's not. That's not. It's the math is close to right, I guess.
Yeah.
All right. Here's a good one because someone writes, and the humility at the end of this is what I really like. He says there's an asterisk. I could be wrong. Here's the question. Why is it a slush fund? Because it has to be earmarked for a project, and it isn't, to quote the questioner, it isn't like Daley can use it to take joyrides at Six Flags or something. I mean, so why is it a slush fund when it's earmarked for a specific project?
Well, that's what I was saying earlier, Mike, the first thing I said. And one of the two fundamental flaws that I see with the way TIFs work in Chicago, I'm talking specifically about Chicago, is that unlike that first TIF that Rachel alluded to, the Central Loop TIF, the TIFs aren't limited to one project. The amount of money that a TIF district can collect is far greater than any one project that's proposed at the time the district is created. So the reason why it's a slush fund is that it brings in more money than it's dedicated to spend. Hence, there's this extra money. And so it's been called many different things. Jim Houlihan, the assessor, calls it the Mayor Daley's funny money. I've heard Quigley used to call it Mayor Daley's private piggy bank. So I don't know. I like slush fund.
Hey, and here's one that I find interesting because we're talking about doing a little remodeling of our BGA office as we outgrow our current quarters. I think this is a question from the only member of our board here tonight, Bill Donnell, who resides in one of my favorite buildings, the Monadnock building downtown. We couldn't afford an office there, even with Bill's help. But the question is, can TIF funds be used to improve the interior of a building for a prospective tenant? Yes? So I want a TIF at the BGA building. Now, can they be, I mean, once the money is allocated, I mean, it can go for anything, right?
Based on what the redevelopment plan states. I mean, they're all different from TIF to TIF.
But there's nothing, I mean, it could just as easily include interior improvements.
A lot of those relocation deals where one business was moving from one quarter to another, one building to another, without creating any new jobs, where the funds were used for what we call tenant build-out, right? So sort of tailoring the interior of a building to accommodate a new tenant.
What's that?
$15 million for the Chicago Merchant Exchange, CME.
The Merc.
Yeah.
Well, those people were in dire need. What kind of
district?
That's right, and lots of people do that. Yeah. The mayor does. That is a good way to get the mayor's attention. Okay, so here's one that kind of follows on the question the gentleman in the fourth row here was making about downtown. If you wipe out $700 million TIF dollars, how will you incentivize private equity investment in downtown Chicago? And that's sort of what you were alluding to, Rachel. 10 years ago, it might have been a good idea when the money was flowing. Now, is it risky in terms of the health of downtown?
To stop the TIF program?
To basically do what we're talking about, take all that money now and basically give it back to government to balance budgets.
I think that it's a risk that a lot of municipalities that don't use TIF are having to face, where they're more dependent on what's happening with the private market. As I said earlier, I think the city still has at its disposal a lot of very powerful tools. The ability to grant, for example, zoning bonuses and allow a developer to build higher than they might have been able to build otherwise is a very, it goes straight to the bottom line of a developer. That's a big incentive. We also have good old-fashioned, different kinds of tax abatements and, other ways of building infrastructure, like going to the bond market and just floating a bond that would still be attractive to developers and would certainly garner development interest. Whether or not that would be enough to maintain the kind of investment that was taking place over the last boom, probably not. But as I said, there's a lot more things at stake here, and a lot more things sort of driving the real estate market than this particular public policy.
Okay, so it might be anomalous to ask this question of Ben, who, as Spiro Agnew once famously said, is, at least on this issue, a nattering nabob of negativism. The best use of TIF in downtown Chicago is?
Whoa.
None of the above.
Have they ever?
I could have asked that.
No, okay, now here's the thing about TIFs. Again, like Rachel's saying, it's merely a way of subsidizing a deal. So you have to look at it deal by deal. And so putting aside from whether they collect more money than they're ever going to spend, hence it's a slush fund, and putting aside whether some businesses get it who don't deserve it, and putting aside that it's intended for poor communities but it largely goes to wealthy, and putting aside that it's not transparent, it's not on our tax bills, and putting aside that it takes money from the schools and the parks and it raises our taxes, putting all that aside, I love Millennium Park.
You know what?
So, yay, Mayor
you are
Daley.
bloody right about that.
And those theaters downtown, I love plays. So, yay, Mayor Daley.
And I'm kind of retro, so I like Navy Pier. Okay,
didn't get any
yes,
tips
no
down.
question. How can a TIF be abolished once it's created? Tom, is that how can it?
They've reached their financial goal. I mean, their redevelopment plan is complete. There have been a lot of communities that have terminated their TIFs early, paid off their bonds. The area itself grew faster than they anticipated. I mean, that's just by simple ordinance, so very simple.
Okay, two more questions, and this one is for either Ben or Rachel. This is a research question. Where can individuals get more information about the TIFs in their specific wards?
Wow, that is tough to find out. Okay, one of my great struggles with the city of Chicago is they do not adequately list anywhere on their website a ward-by-ward breakdown of TIFs. They do it TIF district by TIF district, and then they categorize those TIF districts by areas of the city. So you can figure out, okay, I live on the north side, so you look at the north side districts, and then you look at the names of the TIF districts, like Lincoln, Belmont, Ashland, and you say, well, I live near there, okay? So you can look there, all right? But there is no ward-by-ward breakdown, and the obvious reason is if they did a ward-by-ward breakdown, even people as clueless as the ones who live in Chicago would figure out that some wards are getting a lot more money than other wards. So they prefer to keep it as general and vague as they can.
But you've written about that. You've written about ward distribution.
You know what, Andy? The first thing that I had to learn, as hard as this was to learn, I thought when I first wrote about this program, there would be just outrage in the streets of the city of Chicago. I had to write about this program for like 6 years, I think, before anybody paid attention. So it's a complicated program, and it's not always as easy to get the message out.
Okay, two quick questions, and then we'll let everybody head home after. You guys are remarkable because this is dry, but it's so important, and for people to sort of understand now that things, we didn't pay attention to dry stuff like derivatives and subprime mortgages, and look what happened. So I guess maybe we're wising up and understanding that even if they're complicated, it might pay to give it a little attention. What's the likelihood of Fritchie's proposals passing the General Assembly? And just in quick summary form, he wants an audit of how TIF funds have been spent. He wants the money returned to the various taxing bodies, which we've already discussed, and he wants the schools to be exempted from future TIF projects so they can keep their tax dollars. I don't cover politics anymore, so I have to admit I'm a little out of the loop. Do any of you have a sense of whether those, maybe Tom, as the statewide head of this, do you think any of that stuff, does anything have a chance of passage?
Who knows? We got a gubernatorial election coming up. I've always said this. I've never questioned the infinite wisdom of the Illinois General Assembly. You don't know what's going to happen. You'll make a guess, you'll predict something, and it goes direct. I have not a clue.
Well,
at all.
you're saying I thought didn't you really mean you've never noticed the infinite wisdom of the Illinois General Assembly?
Never questioned.
Oh, okay. And here's one last one, and this Ben was charitable in his description of Block 37, which probably has been the single largest land boondoggle in the city, at least from my standpoint. But my favorite part of Block 37 is the fact that underneath Block 37 is a $200 million plus rail CTA station with nowhere to go. This was built to be the alternate high-speed rail route to O'Hare, and it sits there as a hole in the ground that cost more than $200 million. And so the question that comes from one of our attendees is, will any TIF money be made available for Mayor Daley's new high-speed train to O'Hare? I assume you mean the high-speed train from under Block 37, right? Unless there's a different one? Okay, so does anybody think that there'll be some TIF?
Alan's correct. I don't think a new mayor would throw TIF dollars at that with all the pressing needs. I'd like to believe, anyway, that no new mayor would throw TIF dollars after that with all the pressing needs we have. I read in today's, I believe it was the Bright one, that Mayor Daley, oh, God, it's always scary when he comes back from some foreign country.
You're dating yourself,
yeah,
Ben. The Bright one is a term for the Sun
He goes to a foreign
Times.
country and he sees something, he's like, I got to have it, and the next thing and they say, yes, boss, whatever you want, no matter, it's the TIF program, it's free money. So he came back and he's talking, I was in Shanghai, and these investors told me, all they want to do is spend money building rails to go from Midway to Loop. So I'm like, oh my God, can we get rid of this guy fast enough? So my hunch is that there will never be a high-speed rail between the city of Chicago, Loop, and its airports, at least in my lifetime.
Do either of you have a thought on that? Well, let me do this then. Let's let each of our panelists offer a final thought on TIFs if they'd like, something that hasn't been asked or answered, or a piece of information they think we should not be able to leave the room without having. You want to go first, Rachel, or is there one more final thought that's worth sharing?
I guess, again, that it's a tool, right? It's a tool that can be used for good or evil. And so the tool itself, even though it sometimes seems like it's sort of the tail wagging the dog, kind of conforms to the political culture that it finds itself in. So if you looked at Minneapolis, for example, TIF is used to sort of enable a very active neighborhood planning process where each neighborhood group gets a little cut. And so there's nothing saying that, we couldn't do that here. And some organizations in Hyde Park, in North Lawndale, up in Edgewater, have started community organizations have said, we'd like a say in how these funds are used. But it requires a sort of altering of the political culture. But I think it's kind of like those, fish or insects that camouflage themselves in their contexts and their environments. It sort of takes on the qualities of
We call them chameleons.
Yeah, chameleons. So I think that that it's a bigger issue. What we're talking about here, development politics, fiscal politics, these are much bigger issues than just TIF alone.
Okay, Tom, you have a final thought?
Yeah, I'd just say, as the executive director of the Illinois Tax Increment Association, it's one of the last tools available to municipalities with this state and fiscal budget crisis. You can go to my website and download an enormous amount of information free. You don't have to be a member, and it's www.illinois-tif.com, and you can download quite a bit of stuff that we've already been talking about. So. Just www.illinois-tif.com. So.
A final thought, Ben?
I actually agree with everything that Rachel said, that it is a tool. It doesn't have to be good. It doesn't have to be evil. It's really goes city to city. And so when I think about the way TIFs work in Chicago, I tend not to blame really Mayor Daley for all the abuses. I blame the citizens of Chicago.